December 29th, 1170. Canterbury Cathedral. The air is as cold as the grave, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of incense and the damp chill of ancient stone. Outside, a winter twilight bleeds across the sky, but inside, shadows devour the vast Gothic space, leaving only pools of flickering candlelight to dance upon the columns. The sound is of eternity itself, the serene, hypnotic drone of monks chanting vespers, a river of Latin prayer flowing through the cavernous nave, a sound that has measured the passing of centuries. But then, another sound. A jarring, violent intrusion. The heavy oak doors crash open, the wood groaning in protest, and the sacred quiet is shattered by the brutal clang of armored feet on stone flags. Panic erupts like a flock of startled birds. Monks scatter, their prayers turning to gasps of terror. Into the holy light stride four figures, silhouetted against the dying day, their chainmail glinting like the scales of serpents. They are not soldiers here for war. They are wolves in the fold. Reginald Fitzurse, his face a mask of grim purpose, bellows a name that echoes to the vaulted ceiling, a profane shout in a hallowed place. Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the kingdom? From the steps of the altar, a tall, imposing figure emerges from the gloom, his white robes a beacon in the darkness. There is no fear in his eyes, only a cold, resolute calm. This is the narrative of him, the Archbishop, and his final moments. He does not hide. He faces the steel, the hatred, the worldly fury that has hunted him down in the very sanctuary of his God. The confrontation is brief, the exchange of words a mere formality before the inevitable butchery. The first sword blow, meant to intimidate, slices through the air and knocks his cap to the ground, revealing the shaved tonsure of a priest. The second blow, delivered with killing force, bites deep into his skull. A monk, Edward Grimm, cries out, his own arm nearly severed as he tries to shield his master. The sound of the blade on bone is sickeningly sharp, followed by the crimson spray that spatters the sacred altar and the white marble floor. Another blow, and another, until the Archbishop lies broken at the feet of his assassins, his brains and blood a gruesome offering on the cathedral's cold stones. The murderers, their frenzy spent, recoil in the sudden, horrifying silence before turning and fleeing into the night, leaving behind a sacrilege that would shake the foundations of Christendom. This was the saga of how the king's greatest friend became his most defiant martyr. To comprehend the chilling finality of that moment, to understand how a bond forged in friendship and power could be so utterly shattered by a sword in a sacred place, we must first understand the man himself and the central, dramatic paradox of his life. This is the narrative of Thomas Becket, but it is also the story of King Henry II, for their lives were two vines so intertwined that the growth of one meant the strangulation of the other. The core question is not simply who killed Becket, but what killed him. What force could be so potent as to transform the king's most worldly and loyal servant, a man who loved fine clothes, fast horses, and the thrill of the political game, into an ascetic, unbending prince of the church, willing to die for a principle? The answer, as whispered in the chronicles and shouted in the sermons that followed his death, was faith. But it was not a simple, gentle faith. It was an absolute, all-consuming, and terrifyingly militant faith, adopted with the same total commitment and ferocious energy that Becket had once devoted to serving his earthly king. He was a man incapable of half measures. When he was the king's chancellor, he was the most effective and ruthless instrument of royal power England had ever seen. When he became Archbishop of Canterbury, He became the most stubborn and implacable defender of the Church's power the world had ever known. He did not change his nature. He only changed his master. The paradox is that Henry himself engineered this transformation. In his arrogant belief that he could control any man, he placed his most loyal friend in the one position that demanded a higher loyalty, forcing a choice between the temporal and the divine. Becket's story is therefore not one of a good man fighting an evil king, but a far more complex and tragic tale of two brilliant, proud, and unyielding men, both believing they were right, locked in a struggle over the soul of their kingdom. It is the saga of how absolute loyalty to a friend became absolute loyalty to God, and how that shift in allegiance set in motion a chain of events that could only end in blood and martyrdom. To grasp the intensity of this personal conflict, we must zoom out to the vast and violent chessboard of mid-12th century Europe, a world teetering between the old ways of feudal chaos and the new assertions of centralized power. The stage for our drama, the Kingdom of England, was a wounded and fractured land, just beginning to stitch itself back together after 2 decades of horrific civil war known as the Anarchy. Castles had been thrown up without license, lands had been seized, and the authority of the crown had withered to almost nothing. Into this vacuum stepped a young, dynamic, and utterly ruthless force of nature, Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and by 21, King of England. His domains stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, a sprawling collection of territories that would come to be known as the Angevin Empire. Henry's life's ambition was singular and monumental: to impose order. He sought to crush the rogue barons, demolish the illegal castles, and most importantly, establish a single, unified legal system, the King's Law, that would apply to every man and woman in his kingdom. This was the great project of his reign, the foundation of what would become English common law. But there was one colossal obstacle standing in his way, an institution that saw itself as a sovereign power, independent of any earthly king. This was the Church. In the 12th century, the Catholic Church was not merely a spiritual body, it was a transnational superstate, with its own laws, its own courts, its own taxes, and its own ruler in Rome, the Pope. It claimed jurisdiction over all criminous clerks, meaning any clergyman accused of a crime, from petty theft to murder, could only be tried in a church court, where punishments were notoriously lenient and did not include execution. To Henry, this benefit of clergy was an intolerable affront to his authority, a gaping hole in his vision of a perfectly ordered kingdom under one law. It was this fundamental clash between a king determined to be master in his own house and a church determined to answer only to God that formed the geopolitical fault line upon which the entire tragedy of Henry and Becket would be built. Into this world of titanic forces was born a man whose destiny was not inherited, but forged. Thomas Becket was not a product of the landed aristocracy, not a son of the great Norman barons who had conquered England a century before. He was born in Cheapside, London, the son of Gilbert Becket, a merchant of Norman descent. This background is the key to everything that followed. He was an outsider, a man whose currency was not land or titles, but intellect, charm, and a relentless, burning ambition. His world was not the feudal castle with its rigid hierarchies, but the bustling, dynamic, multilingual commercial hub of London. It was a world where a clever man could rise on his own merits, and this reality shaped his entire worldview. He received a superb education, first at Merton Priory and later in Paris, Bologna, and Auxerre, studying the intricacies of canon law. This education sharpened his already formidable mind into a precision instrument. He was meticulous, organized, with a prodigious memory and a flair for administration that bordered on genius. But he was also a man of immense personal charisma. Tall, handsome, and articulate, he possessed an easy charm that could disarm opponents and win powerful patrons. This combination of intellectual rigor and personal magnetism made him a man to watch. His origins instilled in him a hunger to prove himself, to outshine the high-born men who looked down on him as a merchant's son. He developed a taste for the finer things in life: rich clothes, fine wines, lavish feasts, and magnificent horses. He was not an ascetic by nature. He was a man who loved the world and was determined to conquer it on his own terms. His character was a complex tapestry of ambition, piety, and pragmatism, a man forged in the crucible of a new, rising urban class, destined to collide with the ancient powers of throne and altar. The first great door to open for this ambitious son of London was not into the court of the king, but into the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Becket. This was Becket's first true step into the great game of English politics. In the mid-1140s, he entered Theobald's service, and it was here, under the tutelage of the most powerful cleric in England, that he learned the delicate and often treacherous art of governance. Theobald's household was a formidable intellectual center, a training ground for future bishops and administrators, and Becket quickly distinguished himself as the most brilliant of them all. He was not yet a priest. He was a master administrator, an expert in canon law, and a skilled diplomat. Theobald entrusted him with several sensitive missions to the papal court in Rome, journeys that exposed Becket to the highest echelons of European power politics. He saw firsthand how the immense spiritual authority of the Pope was wielded as a political weapon, a lesson that would not be lost on him. It was during his time with Theobald that Becket's reputation for efficiency, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty grew. He became the Archbishop's right-hand man, the indispensable manager of the English Church's vast administrative machinery, and it was in this capacity that he caught the eye of the man who would define his life. In 1154, Theobald, recognizing the need to build a bridge to the new, formidable young king, Henry II, recommended his most talented archdeacon for the post of Lord Chancellor. It was a fateful recommendation. Henry, always with an eye for talent, saw in Becket not just a skilled administrator, but a reflection of his own energy and ambition. A man who could help him tame the chaos of his kingdom. For Becket, this was the ultimate prize, the culmination of all his efforts, a position of immense secular power, second only to the king himself. The first act of his drama was over. The second was about to begin. Every great man is driven by a hidden engine, a secret motivation that fuels his ascent and often precipitates his fall. For Thomas Becket, this engine was a profound and all-consuming ambition, a relentless perfectionism that demanded he not just participate in the world, but master it. In his early career, this ambition was directed entirely toward secular ends. His inner demon was the desire to transcend his humble origins, to prove to the Norman aristocracy that a merchant's son could be more powerful, more magnificent, and more indispensable than any of them. He craved recognition, and he understood that in the world of Henry II, power was the only currency that truly mattered. As Chancellor, he embraced this worldly ambition with a passion that astonished everyone. He did not simply serve the king. He became the architect of the king's power, the very embodiment of royal authority. His personal household rivaled the king's in its splendor. He kept a lavish table, his clothes were made of the richest fabrics, and his retinue of knights, clerks, and servants was a small army. When he traveled to France on a diplomatic mission in 1158, he did so with a procession so magnificent, with hundreds of retainers, wagons of English beer, and even monkeys riding on the backs of horses, that it left the French court breathless with awe. This was not just vanity, it was a calculated projection of the power of the English crown, and by extension, his own. He wanted to be the perfect chancellor, just as he had been the perfect archdeacon. This drive for perfection, however, was a double-edged sword. It meant that whatever role he inhabited, he would inhabit it completely, to its logical and often extreme conclusion. There was no room for compromise or half measures in his psychology. He was a man of absolutes. This hidden motivation, this need to excel beyond all measure, was what made him such a formidable servant of the state. But it was also the tragic flaw that would, when his circumstances changed, make him an equally formidable enemy of that same state. A man who would pursue the logic of spiritual perfection to the point of death itself. The fateful alliance that would shape the destiny of England for a generation began in 1155. It was the meeting of two men who were in many ways mirror images of each other. Henry II was young, just 22, a man of ferocious energy, with a brilliant legal mind and a restless, almost demonic, drive to restore order to his shattered kingdom. He was a whirlwind of a man, constantly on the move, rarely sitting still, a king who preferred the saddle to the throne room. Thomas Becket, at 37, was older, more polished, a master of administration and diplomacy, but he shared the king's boundless energy and his passion for efficiency. Theirs was not merely a professional relationship. It was, by all accounts, a deep and genuine friendship. They were an inseparable pair, the king and his chancellor, governing England as if with a single mind. They would work for long hours, poring over legal documents and state affairs, and then spend their evenings in raucous camaraderie. They hunted together. They played chess together. They drank together. And they plotted the future of the kingdom together. Henry found in Thomas a man who not only understood his grand vision, but could execute it with flawless precision. Thomas, for his part, found in Henry a master worthy of his immense talents, a king whose trust gave him almost limitless power. There was an intimacy between them that went far beyond that of a sovereign and his subject. The chroniclers of the time report that the king would often ride his horse straight into the great hall where Becket was dining and leap over the table to join him, sharing his cup and his food. In one famous story, they were riding through the streets of London in winter when the king, seeing a poor man shivering in thin rags, impulsively ripped the magnificent fur-lined cloak from Becket's own shoulders and gave it to the beggar, much to the chancellor's chagrin and the laughter of their attendants. It was a friendship of equals in intellect and spirit, if not in rank. Henry trusted Becket so completely that he even placed his own son and heir, the young Henry, in the chancellor's household to be raised and educated. This was the ultimate sign of favor, a bond that seemed unbreakable, forged in the fires of shared ambition and mutual affection. As Lord Chancellor, Thomas Becket became the hammer of the king, and he wielded that hammer with terrifying efficiency. The price of power was absolute loyalty, and Becket paid it without hesitation. For 7 years, from 1155 to 1162, he was the most powerful man in England after the king himself, and he used that power to relentlessly advance the royal agenda, often at the expense of the very institution that had first nurtured him, the church. If Henry wanted a tax, Becket found a way to levy it. One of the most controversial of these was the scutage, a fee paid by knights to avoid military service, which Becket rigorously applied to church lands, forcing bishops and abbots to pay for the king's wars. This caused immense resentment among the clergy, who saw one of their own, the Archdeacon of Canterbury no less, acting as the king's enforcer against them. Becket seemed to revel in his secular role. He shed any pretense of clerical austerity. His lifestyle was that of a great feudal lord. His hospitality was legendary, his table laden with exotic foods and fine wines. He was a patron of scholars and a master of the hunt, with a magnificent collection of hawks and hounds. He even proved himself a capable military commander. During Henry's campaign in Toulouse in 1159, the chancellor himself led a contingent of 700 of his own knights into battle, clad in full armor, proving more of a warrior than many of the hereditary barons. He was, in every sense, the king's man. He was the efficient administrator, the brilliant diplomat, the loyal friend, and the ruthless enforcer of the royal will. He demonstrated to Henry, time and time again, that his loyalty to the throne was absolute, trumping any residual loyalty he might have felt to the Church. This period was crucial, for it was the foundation of Henry's greatest and most tragic miscalculation. He had seen Becket subordinate the Church's interests to the Crown's for 7 years. He had no reason to believe that would ever change. He saw a man who was his creation, an extension of his own will, and he failed to see the powerful, unyielding core of the man himself, waiting for a new and greater role to inhabit. The primary antagonist in this unfolding drama was not a person, not a rival king or a rebellious baron. It was an idea, an ancient and powerful principle that had been shaping European history for centuries. Libertas ecclesiae, the liberty of the Church. This was not simply a call for freedom of worship. It was a profound political and legal doctrine. It held that the Church was a divine institution, founded by Christ himself, and as such, it stood apart from and, in matters of morality and faith, above the temporal authority of kings and emperors. Its head was the Pope in Rome, the vicar of Christ on earth, and all clergy were ultimately his subjects, not the subjects of their local rulers. This doctrine had been the cause of epic conflicts across Europe, most notably the investiture controversy between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperors, a struggle over the right to appoint bishops. In England, the most practical and contentious expression of this liberty was the benefit of clergy. This was the right of any ordained clerk to be tried for any crime, no matter how serious, in an ecclesiastical court. These courts, governed by canon law, could not impose the death penalty. In practice, this meant that a priest who committed murder could escape the king's justice with a punishment of defrocking or imprisonment, while a layman would be hanged for the same crime. To a king like Henry II, obsessed with creating a uniform system of justice, this was an intolerable anomaly. He saw it as a shield for criminals, a direct challenge to his sovereignty. He famously complained that there were over 100 murders committed by clergymen in the first years of his reign, for which the culprits had escaped proper punishment. This abstract principle, this idea of a parallel legal system and a supranational loyalty, was the immovable object against which Henry's irresistible force was destined to collide. It was a silent, powerful antagonist, woven into the very fabric of medieval society, and it was waiting for a champion to give it a voice. The fatal mistake, the pivot upon which the entire tragedy turns, came in 1161 with the death of Archbishop Theobald. For Henry, this was a golden opportunity. The Archbishopric of Canterbury was the most powerful position in the English Church, and for years, Theobald, while a moderate, had been a defender of ecclesiastical privileges. Now, Henry conceived of a plan of breathtaking political genius. He would appoint his own man to the position, someone he could trust implicitly to align the church with the crown's objectives. And who was more trustworthy, more loyal, more demonstrably his man than his own chancellor, Thomas Becket? By uniting the highest office of the state with the highest office of the church in the person of his best friend, Henry believed he would end the conflict between crown and altar forever. He would have his puppet archbishop, and the last obstacle to his legal reforms would be removed. He pushed Becket's candidacy forward, overriding the objections of the Canterbury monks and many of the bishops. He saw it as the masterstroke of his reign. But this was the moment of his greatest misjudgment, a catastrophic failure to understand the psychology of the man he thought he knew so well. For Becket, the appointment was not a political coronation, but a terrifying psychological breaking point. He resisted it. According to several chroniclers, he warned the king directly, "My lord, if I were to be appointed, our friendship would soon turn to the bitterest hatred." He knew himself better than Henry knew him. He understood that he could not serve two masters. He knew that his all-or-nothing personality, his relentless perfectionism, would force him to embrace the role of archbishop with the same totality with which he had embraced the role of chancellor. But Henry, blinded by his own ambition and his belief in their friendship, laughed off his warnings. In June of 1162, Thomas Becket was consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury. The king believed he had just won the game. In reality, he had just created his own most formidable adversary. The chaos that Thomas Becket exploited was not external, but internal. It was the chaos of a soul undergoing a violent and profound transformation. The moment the sacred oil touched his head at his consecration, the king's chancellor died and the archbishop was born. He did not see this as an opportunity for political power, but as a divine mandate, a terrifying call to spiritual warfare. The change was immediate, dramatic, and to the royal court, utterly baffling. His first act was to resign the chancellorship, sending the Great Seal back to the king. It was a public declaration of his new allegiance. The king was stunned and infuriated. This was not part of the plan. Then came the changes in his personal life. The lavish feasts ceased, replaced by simple meals. The rich silks and furs were abandoned for the humble robes of a monk. And beneath these robes, unseen by the world, he began to wear a coarse hair shirt, a secret act of mortification that would only be discovered after his death. He subjected himself to daily floggings, spent long hours in prayer and study of the scriptures, and performed acts of charity, washing the feet of the poor. The worldling had become an ascetic. This was not hypocrisy. It was the total immersion of a perfectionist in his new role. He had set out to be the perfect chancellor, and now he was determined to be the perfect archbishop. And in the 12th century model, the perfect archbishop was a staunch defender of libertas ecclesiae, a warrior for the rights of the church against the encroachments of secular power. The king, who had expected a pliable courtier, found himself facing a rigid, unbending man of God. Becket had found, in the authority of the church, a power greater than the king's, an absolute to which he could dedicate his entire being. This sudden, shocking transformation was his opportunity, his way of turning the king's political maneuver into a spiritual crusade. The inner chaos of his conversion had forged a new man, and this new man would now challenge the very foundations of the king's power. The great confrontation, the moment when the simmering conflict erupted into open war, came in January of 1164 at a royal council held at Clarendon Palace. This was Becket's greatest triumph, not of arms or politics, but of will. Henry, determined to codify his authority over the Church once and for all, presented a 16-article document known as the Constitutions of Clarendon. This was the culmination of his legal ambitions. The constitutions asserted that clergy accused of crimes should be tried in royal courts, that no tenant-in-chief could be excommunicated without the king's consent, and that all appeals to the Pope in Rome required royal permission. It was a systematic attempt to dismantle the legal independence of the Church in England and subject it entirely to the king's will. Henry demanded that all the bishops swear an unconditional oath to observe these ancient customs of the realm. Initially, under immense pressure from the king and his fellow bishops, Becket verbally agreed. But this was a moment of weakness that would haunt him. When presented with the written document to which he was expected to affix his seal, his conscience rebelled. In a dramatic reversal, he refused. He stood before the full fury of the king and the assembled barons and declared that he could not, in good conscience, assent to articles that violated the sacred liberties of the Church. The king exploded in a characteristic fit of rage, threatening Becket with violence. The other bishops, terrified, begged him to submit. But Becket held firm. This was his spiritual victory, the moment he publicly chose God over his king and friend. Later that year, at a council in Northampton, Henry had Becket tried on trumped-up charges of financial misconduct from his time as chancellor. It was a clear attempt to destroy him. Rather than submit to judgment, Becket, clutching his archbishop's cross as a symbol of his authority, defied the court and fled the kingdom in disguise, escaping by boat to the continent. He had lost England, but in his own mind, and in the eyes of many across Christendom, he had won a moral victory. He was now an exile, a confessor for the faith, ready to wage his war from afar. In exile in France, Becket's psychology underwent a further hardening. The physical distance from England and the king's immediate power allowed his conviction to solidify into a form of spiritual hubris. He was no longer just a defender of the Church's rights. He saw himself as a martyr in waiting, a righteous warrior locked in a cosmic struggle against a tyrannical king who had usurped the authority of God himself. He found refuge first at the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, where he embraced an even more austere monastic life. He was convinced of the absolute justice of his cause, and this conviction made him increasingly inflexible. He began to see compromise not as a diplomatic necessity, but as a spiritual betrayal. From his exile, he issued letters and decrees, threatening the king and excommunicating his supporters in England, including several bishops who had sided with the crown. He saw the world in stark, black and white terms. On one side was God, the Pope, and himself. On the other was the devil, King Henry, and his evil customs. This moment of triumph in his own mind, this embrace of his role as a persecuted champion of the faith, blinded him to the political realities of his situation. The Pope, Alexander III, while sympathetic to Becket's principles, was also a pragmatist engaged in his own struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor and his anti-pope. He needed Henry's support and could not afford a complete breach with England. The Pope urged moderation and negotiation, but Becket, consumed by his own righteous certainty, often ignored these counsels, seeing them as a temptation to waver. His hubris was not that of a man seeking personal glory, but something far more dangerous. The hubris of a man utterly convinced that his own will was synonymous with the will of God. This unyielding righteousness, this psychology of a triumphant martyr, would make any genuine reconciliation with Henry impossible and set the stage for the final, tragic act of his life. The sworn enemy, the other half of this tragic equation, was a king consumed by a cold and lasting fury. The transformation of Thomas Becket from friend to foe inflicted a deep and personal wound on Henry II. It was not just a political problem, it was a profound betrayal. He had raised this man from obscurity, showered him with wealth and power, trusted him with his own son, and loved him like a brother. In Henry's eyes, Becket's defiance was the blackest ingratitude. This sense of personal betrayal fueled an obsessive, venomous feud that would last for 6 years. The king, known for his volcanic temper, the infamous Angevin rage, would fly into paroxysms of fury at the very mention of Becket's name. Chroniclers describe him chewing the rushes on the floor, his eyes blazing with hatred. But his response was not just emotional, it was cold and calculated. He immediately seized all the lands and revenues of the See of Canterbury. Then, in an act of particular cruelty, he decreed the exile of Becket's entire family and all the members of his household, hundreds of men, women, and children, shipping them to the continent in the dead of winter, forcing them to live in poverty, a constant, visible reproach to the exiled archbishop. This was a king who understood how to make his enemies suffer. His obsession was also rooted in his own form of hubris. Henry was an architect of power, a man who believed in his absolute right to rule and in the supremacy of his law. Becket's defiance was a direct challenge to the very core of his identity as a king. It was a declaration that there was a power in his own kingdom that he could not control. This he could not abide. The feud became the central, poisoning drama of his reign. He would negotiate, then threaten, then negotiate again, but he could never bring himself to concede the central point. The friendship had curdled into a bitter, personal war between two equally stubborn men, a king who demanded absolute obedience and a priest who offered his obedience only to God. At the heart of their conflict lay Henry's grandest project, the creation of a unified legal system for England. While Becket was in exile, the king pressed forward with his reforms, laying the foundations of what would become English common law. This was Henry's true genius, his most enduring legacy. He was not just a warrior, he was a legislator. He expanded the use of royal writs, standardized legal procedures, and sent itinerant justices, judges from his own court, traveling throughout the kingdom to hear cases. This brought the king's justice to every corner of the land, replacing the often arbitrary and inconsistent judgments of local feudal lords. His goal was to create a system where law was predictable, rational, and above all, uniform, flowing directly from the authority of the crown. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166, not to be confused with the constitutions, was a landmark step in this process, establishing the origins of the grand jury system. This was revolutionary work, the painstaking construction of a modern state. But the entire edifice had a fundamental flaw, a great crack running through its foundation: the benefit of clergy. As long as a significant portion of the population, and the clergy made up a substantial number of literate people, remained outside the jurisdiction of his courts, his system would never be truly whole. The Church's legal independence was the last great bastion of non-royal power in the kingdom. Becket, therefore, was more than just a personal enemy. He became the living symbol of the one thing Henry could not control, the personification of the obstacle preventing the completion of his life's work. The struggle was not just over legal principles, it was over two competing visions of society. Henry's vision was of a centralized secular state governed by the king's law. Becket's was of a Christendom where the Church's law, God's law, was supreme. These two visions could not coexist peacefully. The drama of Henry and Becket did not unfold in a vacuum. It was a spectacle played out on the international stage, with the great powers of Europe as both audience and participants. The most important secondary character in this complex game was Pope Alexander III. The Pope was in an incredibly difficult position. On one hand, he was the spiritual head of the Church, and he could not be seen to abandon an archbishop who was defending the Church's sacred liberties. He sympathized with Becket's principles. On the other hand, Alexander was a political pragmatist. He was embroiled in his own bitter struggle against the powerful Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, who had set up a rival pope, or anti-pope. In this conflict, the support of the wealthy and powerful King of England was crucial. Alexander could not afford to alienate Henry completely, lest he switch his allegiance to the anti-pope, which would be a catastrophic blow to his own authority. Consequently, the Pope's policy throughout the 6-year exile was a masterful, if frustrating, balancing act. He would offer Becket moral support and condemn the constitutions of Clarendon, but he would also restrain the Archbishop from taking his most extreme measures, such as placing all of England under interdict, a ban on all church services, or excommunicating the king himself. Another key player was King Louis VII of France. As Henry's chief feudal rival, Louis saw the conflict as a perfect opportunity to weaken the Angevin Empire. He granted Becket refuge in France and offered him financial and political support, not out of any deep piety, but as a classic medieval power play. He delighted in presenting himself as the protector of the persecuted church, all the while using Becket as a pawn to destabilize his powerful English neighbor. Within England itself, the bishops were divided. Some, like Gilbert Folio, the Bishop of London, were staunch supporters of the king, believing Becket's intransigence was damaging the church. Others sympathized with their archbishop, but were too afraid of the king's wrath to offer open support. This web of competing interests, a cautious pope, a manipulative French king, and a divided English episcopate, formed the complex backdrop against which Becket's lonely and stubborn struggle was waged. After 6 years of bitter stalemate, of failed negotiations and mutual recriminations, the first cracks of a final, catastrophic storm began to appear. The harbinger of the end came not from Becket, but from Henry. In his desperation to secure the succession of his dynasty, the king decided upon a move that was a direct and deliberate provocation. He resolved to have his eldest son, Henry the young king, crowned as his co-ruler. The coronation of an English monarch was a sacred rite that, by ancient tradition, belonged exclusively to the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was one of the see's most important and symbolic privileges. To have anyone else perform the ceremony was a profound insult and a flagrant violation of ecclesiastical law. And yet, this is precisely what Henry did. In June of 1170, knowing full well the implications of his actions, he had the ceremony performed at Westminster Abbey by Roger de Pont-l'Évêque, the Archbishop of York, assisted by the bishops of London and Salisbury, Becket's greatest adversaries within the English Church. This act was a calculated blow, a message to Becket and to the world that the king could and would govern his kingdom, including its spiritual affairs, without the exiled archbishop. For Becket, this was the ultimate outrage. It was not just a personal slight, it was a sacrilegious attack on the rights of his holy office, an act that threatened the very order of the Church in England. The news reached him in France and galvanized him into action. A partial reconciliation, had recently been patched together, a fragile peace that allowed for his return. But this event poisoned it from the start. The coronation by the Archbishop of York was the point of no return. It created a situation that Becket, with his absolutist mindset, could not possibly ignore. He now prepared to return to England, not as a peacemaker, but as an avenging angel. The fateful act, the final move that sealed his doom, was Becket's decision to return to England armed with the thunderbolts of the Church. A fragile peace had been brokered at Fréteval in July of 1170, a classic diplomatic fudge that allowed Becket to return without formally accepting the constitutions of Clarendon, and for Henry to receive him back without formally abandoning them. But the peace was hollow. Henry had not promised to revoke the coronation of his son, and Becket had secretly obtained letters from the Pope authorizing him to take disciplinary action against the bishops who had participated in the ceremony. This was the key to understanding the psychology of his final error. He was not returning in a spirit of forgiveness. He saw his return as a triumph, a vindication of his long struggle, and he was determined to immediately reassert his authority. His psychology was that of a victor, not a reconciled partner. Before he even set foot on English soil, he sent ahead the papal letters excommunicating the Archbishop of York and suspending the bishops of London and Salisbury. He landed at Sandwich on December 1st, 1170, and was met by jubilant crowds who hailed him as a returning hero. He knew the immense danger he was in. He was warned that the king's agents were everywhere and that his life was at risk. But he was resolute, driven by the conviction that he was carrying out God's will. The excommunication of the 3 prelates was an act of open warfare. It was a direct challenge to the king, a public humiliation of his most loyal supporters. When the 3 bishops fled across the Channel to the king's court in Normandy and told him what Becket had done, they did not just report the facts, they framed it as a rebellion. "My lord," one of them is said to have declared, "while Thomas lives, you will have no good days, nor peaceful kingdom, nor quiet life." They had lit the final fuse. The greatest catastrophe was not a battle or a political defeat, but a few angry words spoken in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The news of Becket's actions, his triumphant return, the excommunication of the bishops, reached Henry at his court at Bourse in Normandy. He had been expecting a reconciliation, a return to some semblance of normality. Instead, he was faced with what he perceived as the ultimate act of defiant treachery. The reports from the exiled bishops painted a picture of Becket marching through England with a band of armed men, stirring up rebellion and threatening to uncrown the young king. The cumulative frustration of 6 years of conflict, the deep wound of personal betrayal, and his own famously short temper all coalesced into a single, explosive moment. He fell into one of his notorious Angevin rages. He railed against the man he had raised from the dust, a man who now repaid him with nothing but trouble and treason. Pacing frantically before his assembled knights and barons, he is said to have shouted the infamous fatal words, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" The exact words are lost to history, variously reported by the chroniclers, but their import was clear to all who heard them. It was a cry of pure, impotent fury. He may not have intended it as a direct order. It was likely just the desperate outburst of a man at the end of his tether. But in a royal court, the king's wishes, even those screamed in a fit of passion, carried immense weight. 4 knights who were present, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, heard the king's cry not as a complaint, but as a command. They saw it as an opportunity to win royal favor by solving the king's most intractable problem. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them, and slipped away from the court. The king's rage had unleashed a force that he could not recall. The catastrophe was now in motion. The final collapse was a grim and inexorable journey from a king's rage to a martyr's tomb. The four knights, interpreting Henry's outburst as their mandate, set out for the coast immediately. Their ride to Canterbury was a descent into a personal and historical abyss. They were not common thugs. They were landed barons, household knights sworn to the king. They likely believed they were acting as loyal servants, as the instruments of royal justice, ridding their master of a persistent traitor. They crossed the English Channel separately to avoid suspicion and rendezvoused at Saltwood Castle near Canterbury, a fortress held by one of the king's supporters. There, on the morning of December 29th, they gathered their own retainers and planned their final move. There was a sense of a political system breaking down, of the raw violence that lay just beneath the surface of medieval law and order being unleashed. While the knights plotted, Becket in Canterbury seemed to be walking toward his fate with a serene, almost eager determination. He had spent Christmas celebrating the Mass in his cathedral, preaching a sermon in which he told his congregation that their archbishop might not be with them for long, and that one of them had already been a martyr, a reference to his predecessor, Saint Alphege, killed by Vikings. He seemed to be preparing himself and his people for what was to come. The psychological collapse was on the king's side. His famous self-control, his legalistic mind, had given way to a fatal emotional outburst. Becket, by contrast, was in a state of supreme psychological control, ready to play the final scene of the drama he had been rehearsing for 7 years. The last chance for a different outcome had vanished the moment the four knights left the king's court. Now, two unstoppable forces were on a collision course: the unthinking loyalty of 4 armed knights and the unbending will of 1 unarmed priest. The hero's finale was a scene of high drama, consciously staged and perfectly executed. When the 4 knights burst into the Archbishop's palace on the afternoon of December 29th, Becket initially met them with calm defiance. They exchanged heated words, the knights demanding he absolve the excommunicated bishops and swear fealty to the young king. He refused on all counts. As the knights withdrew to arm themselves, Becket's panicked monks tried to drag him to safety, to bar the massive doors of the cathedral. But he resisted them. "Away, you cowards," he commanded. "The Church of God must not be made into a fortress." He insisted the doors remain open, for it was the time of Vespers, and the house of God should be open to all. He was not going to die cowering in a locked room. He walked deliberately, not in flight, but in procession, toward the main altar of his cathedral. As the knights, now in full armor with swords drawn, stormed into the darkening church, their shouts echoing in the sacred space, Becket stood his ground near a pillar by the altar steps. He could have fled into the crypts or escaped through the labyrinthine passages of the monastery. He chose not to. He chose his stage. He faced them not as a terrified victim, but as a priest at his post. When Reginald Fitzurse grabbed him, shouting, "You are a dead man," Becket threw him off, calling him a pander. He was fearless to the last. His final words, as the first sword blow struck, were a conscious echo of the early Christian martyrs, a final, perfect performance of the role he had chosen for himself. "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the Church," he declared, I am ready to embrace death." He knelt as if in prayer, commended his soul to God, and accepted the blows that ended his life. It was a finale of supreme, tragic irony. The man who had once commanded armies in the king's name now conquered his enemy not with a sword, but by his willingness to die by one. He had achieved in death a total and permanent victory that had eluded him in life. The legacy of the murder was immediate, explosive, and profound. The king had killed a priest, but in doing so he had created a saint, and the power of a dead saint proved infinitely greater than the power of a living archbishop. News of the sacrilege spread across Europe like wildfire, and Christendom reacted with universal horror and revulsion. King Henry became a pariah, the Herod of his age. The Pope placed his continental domains under interdict, and he was threatened with excommunication. The conflict of interpretations began at once. To the king's supporters, Becket was a traitor who had received a form of rough justice. But to the vast majority of people, he was a martyr for the faith, slain in his own cathedral for defending the church. Almost immediately, miracles began to be reported at his tomb. The blind regained their sight, the lame walked, the sick were healed by touching cloths dipped in his blood. A cult grew around him with astonishing speed. Within 3 years, in 1173, Pope Alexander III, who had so often urged caution upon Becket in life, formally canonized him as a saint. Canterbury Cathedral was transformed from the site of a gruesome murder into the most important pilgrimage destination in northern Europe, rivaling Rome and Santiago de Compostela. The king, who had sought to subordinate the church to his will, now found himself utterly defeated by the power of popular opinion and religious fervor. The turbulent priest had become St. Thomas of Canterbury, a celestial patron whose spiritual authority dwarfed that of any earthly king. In the long run, Henry's vision of royal legal supremacy would eventually triumph in England, most brutally under another Henry, VIII, 4 centuries later. But in the immediate aftermath, Becket had won. The king had lost the battle for the soul of his kingdom, defeated by the ghost of the friend he had destroyed. So we return to the core question, the central paradox. How did the king's worldly friend become his martyr? The final comprehensive answer lies not in a single event, but in the unyielding, absolute nature of Thomas Becket's character. He was a man of total commitment, the same bottomless well of energy, the same meticulous attention to detail, the same ferocious drive for perfection that he had once placed at the service of King Henry, he simply redirected to the service of God. He did not truly change who he was. He changed his allegiance. Henry's fatal error was in failing to understand this. He believed Becket's loyalty was to him, the man. In reality, Becket's loyalty was always to the role he was playing, and his ambition was to play that role to perfection. As chancellor, the role was to be the ultimate servant of the crown, and he played it with a magnificent, ruthless flair. But when Henry, in his act of supreme hubris, cast him in the role of archbishop, he gave him a new script and a new master. The role of the ideal 12th century archbishop demanded absolute loyalty to God and the defense of the church's liberties. Becket, being Becket, could not play this role by half. He could not be partly the king's man and partly God's man. He had to be one or the other, completely and without reservation. The conflict was inevitable because it was a clash of two absolutes within one man, triggered by a king who thought he was appointing a puppet, but had instead unleashed a whirlwind. He was broken not by his enemies, nor by fate, but by the terrible logical extension of his own personality. When the king forced him to choose between two masters, his all-or-nothing soul could only give itself completely to the one he believed held the keys to eternity. The verdict of history is that the saga of Thomas Becket is more than just a medieval power struggle. It is a timeless and universal lesson on the eternal conflict between the secular and the sacred, between the power of the state and the authority of individual conscience. It is a story that asks a fundamental question that echoes down the centuries. Where does a person's ultimate allegiance lie? To the king, the president, the law of the land? Or to a higher law, a moral code, a divine command? Becket's life demonstrates the explosive, world-altering power that can be unleashed when a person decides to answer that question without compromise. His struggle with Henry was a microcosm of the great medieval drama of church and state, the wrestling of the two swords of temporal and spiritual power that defined 1,000 years of European history. It is a testament to how a single individual, armed only with conviction, can stand against the most powerful political machinery of their age. The story is also a profound human tragedy about the fragility of friendship in the face of absolute principles. It shows how love and loyalty can wither and die when they collide with ideology. Henry was not a monster, and Becket was not, in his early life, a saint. They were two brilliant, flawed, and powerful men whose very strengths, Henry's drive for order, Becket's for perfection, drove them into a fatal embrace. The lesson of their lives is a sobering one, that the pursuit of perfect order and the pursuit of perfect faith can both lead to bloodshed, and that the lines between loyalty and betrayal, sainthood and treason, are often drawn in the blood of those who refuse to bend. The final frame, the image that encapsulates the entire epic saga, is not the blood on the cathedral floor, but the scene that followed 4 years later. It is July 12th, 1174. King Henry II, the master of the vast Angevin Empire, the most powerful monarch in Europe, arrives at the city of Canterbury. He is not in his royal finery. He dismounts outside the city walls, removes his boots, and clad in a simple, rough woolen tunic, he begins to walk barefoot through the streets. The rough cobblestones cut his feet, leaving a trail of royal blood. He is a penitent, a pilgrim coming to beg forgiveness from the man he once called friend. He proceeds to the crypt of the cathedral, to the tomb of St. Thomas of Canterbury. There the mighty king kneels. He weeps, and he submits himself to be scourged, whipped by the bishops, abbots, and the 80 monks of Canterbury, each one delivering blows to the bare back of their sovereign lord. This is the ultimate image: the throne, kneeling before the altar; the temporal, humbled before the spiritual. The king's power, which could command armies and make laws, had proven helpless against the power of a dead martyr's bones. The blood of Becket had proven to be a more potent force than all the armies of the Plantagenet king. The friendship was dead, the man was dead, but the idea he had died for, that there is a conscience that owes its allegiance not to a king, but to God, had triumphed in the most dramatic and unexpected way imaginable. The delicious kebab, the aftertaste of this story, is the chilling realization that sometimes faith is indeed stronger than the throne.